So welcome back. And our first section is entitled Methodological Frameworks and Global Perspectives. The five speakers actually are Jiyan Qiao from Leiden University, Baldwin Wong from Hang Seng University of Hong Kong, together with Elton from Lingnan University, then Dawid Rogacz from Adam Mickiewicz University of Poznan, and Yang Fu from National Taiwan University. And the discussant of this panel is Professor Kim Young-min from Seoul National University, who is also the author of the book that I have here, A History of Chinese Political Thought, very important book. And we are very happy to have Professor Kim as our guest and discussant today. So I think we can proceed this way. The speakers will present their papers one after the other. Maybe if you want, you can also introduce yourself just for a few seconds, just tell us about your field of interest specifically. And then I will stop the recording and we will start the discussion phase with Professor Kim and also the rest of the audience. So the first speaker is Jiyan Qiao from Leiden University with a paper entitled Human Nature and Governance, a Framework for Global Comparative Political Philosophy. So please.
Okay, so I hope you can see my share screen.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, a big thanks to our organizers for putting together this wonderful program. So I'm Jiyan Qiao. I'm a lecturer at Leiden University. I work on history of Chinese political thought. My focus is on the middle period, specifically the 11th century. But I also have an interest, like Federico just mentioned, to speak to non-sinologists about from a global comparative perspective. So this idea is a raw idea that emerged from my dissertation research. I'm happy to present it here to hear your feedback and hopefully move the discussion a little bit further. So, the title is Human Nature and Governance, a Framework for Global Comparative Political Philosophy. Here's an overview of the 5 sections that I will be talking about. First, I will point out the most pressing global issue that we are now facing, and scholars have a responsibility to address if we agree that governments around the world have failed. Second, amid this, I will briefly point out that amidst the increasing critique of liberal democracy, more and more political theorists and historians of political thought working on the Western tradition are beginning to turn to the East, specifically China, for intellectual resources. Then I will discuss 2 existing approaches to the study of Chinese political thought, mainly the philosophical and the historical. Based on this, I will propose mine as an alternative. And then in the conclusion, I will point out 2 larger points to draw from my presentation. So of all the issues that the global community are grappling with, perhaps an overarching one is how to better govern human affairs in this globally entangled human condition. If anything, the pandemic just made the profound global entanglement even more apparent. You may object because since 2020, a certain degree of decoupling has been taking place. But so long the human capacities to ever connect, get even more globally connected, do not stop developing. And so long as we know, human consciousness, once developed, they will not retreat, and they will, but will seek to be further developed. So in terms of communications knowledge, technology or means of transportation. So will globalization, despite this short retreat, it will continue, to my point of view. However, when grappling these issues, as I mentioned, political theorists and historians of political thought, more and more of them are finding that Western resources are no longer adequate. One symptom of this discontent can be seen from the increasing criticism that John Rawls has been receiving from, especially the past couple of years, several years. We see two major books, monographs published to historicize him, whereas criticizing him. And then earlier this year, on modern intellectual history, same issue was published during the further criticizing him. At the same time, more and more Western political theorists are trying to parochialize the field of political theory and globalize or internationalize the study of history of political thought, including older generations of scholars like John Donne. They have been avidly learning Chinese political thought, reading the works that are offered. One prominent example, another prominent example in this is James Hankins. In his masterpiece that was published in 2019, the last chapter was titled Light from the East, where we see many figures, many contemporary Confucian political thinkers from whom he has been learning about Chinese political thought. Now this prepares me to turn to my discussion of the existing approaches to Chinese political thought. So it seems to me there are mainly two approaches currently. One is a philosophical one. At least this is how the practitioners they themselves identify. I mainly listed two books here. The China model, sinologists tend to readily dismiss this book, but its influence, this also makes it easy to underestimate its influence. For instance, at the beginning of 2020, when the first wave of COVID-19 was being received around the world, weren't the majority of the countries in the world adopting self-consciously or not the China model in how to handle the pandemic. The other one is Bai Tongdong's recent book. So a major issue is I see in this is that because by labeling their approach philosophical, they also justify their freedom from the more complicated concept of Confucianism. And as a consequence, we see actually a brand of statist political philosophy being relabeled Confucian political theory. What we see probably is in there, in such works of Confucian political theory, is more familiar to more recent approaches to governance than those we found in China's past. Very recently, there emerged a historical approach to the study of Chinese political thought. Here I list a few major events. First, it's in 2017, the Journal of European Journal of Political Theory published a special issue titled Confucianism and its Contexts, showing the several contributors, including our discussant and Professor Michael Lennon, one of our participants. They try to provide a more nuanced approach to the study of Confucianism. then our discussant book, for the first time making available an introduction to the history of Chinese political thought that is non-essentialized and non-nationalistic. And then the same year and following, Peter Ball and James Hankins co-convened a conference at Harvard titled Political Meritocracy in Comparative Historical Perspective. In titling their conference this way, they are trying to highlight the historical part because as we can see from the upper lower corner, the title is actually partially adopted from a book co-edited by Daniel Bell. However, as I said, there's a main issue in this, as welcome as this newly emerged approach is, there's a main issue because historians are committed to not imposing any conceptual framework or language upon the Chinese political thought, the historical world. The result is that their language is too local, making it hard for non-sinologists to access. The result would be that when I have through personal conversations have encountered heard such when they found they are too difficult to access, they will probably still find it much easier to read those the books written on various kinds of Confucian democracy, Confucian political theory, etc. So how do historians remain committed to historicity while making their work more widely and globally shareable to an audience beyond the sinologists? So this is what I try to address in proposing this framework. This framework, of course, as a trained historian, is deeply rooted in historical research. The findings are deeply local. However, it offers a possibility to share such local findings globally. So let's turn to a very brief theoretical formulation. By this, I mean a framework constituted by the relationship between human nature and governance in the work of political philosophers, East and West, past and present. Given this broadly shared tendency across time and place, this relationship between human nature and governance, at East, a political philosopher tends to design their approach to governance on the basis of a particular view of human nature, can act as a global framework. And in what follows, I will come back, elaborate it more toward the end, but in what follows immediately, I shall illustrate this general tendency with a few cases from both ends of Eurasia. My first two cases came from 11th century China. The topics of my dissertation, Wang Shi and Su Shi. Then I will briefly mention Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, two from 17th century England. So as I have argued in my dissertation, Wang Shi saw human nature as malleable. For this reason, when designing his statecraft, he put the focus on how to reshape the inborn nature of human beings so that they would unreflectively think in the interest of the state. This is the key that he figured out to quickly increase state power. This is a philosophical foundation for his belief that moral unity can be attained and that people can be made to uphold the same values. It is also for this same reason that he thinks dissidence cannot be allowed. By contrast, Saussure took human nature as the most constant features of a person that remain the same under all conditions. Based on this idea that human nature is unchangeable, Saussure designed a way of governance formulated in his commentary on the Book of Documents that tasks the government to respond to human needs after they arise. Moreover, given that on this philosophical basis, diversity will be a permanent feature of the human condition, Su thinks that the government should be open to all who wish to contribute to the common good, no matter how differently they see the world. So now we can see these two political philosophers from 11th century China. They designed entirely different approaches to governance. However, there's one thing that they share. Both premised their thought on how to govern human affairs on a particular view of how humans are by nature. And they are not alone in linking human nature with governance. For instance, Thomas Hobbes, Jonathan Wolff pointed out, for Hobbes, political philosophy begins with the study of human nature. And in his Leviathan, we saw here the part one is a study of human nature, of men, and all kinds of, all aspects of how humans are by nature, of their senses, of their imagination, etc. And the part two is on this basis, how the commonwealth should be designed, how human affairs should be governed. The same with John Locke. Although his view of human nature, again, is different from Hobbes. So there are more. In the Chinese tradition, recently scholars find out that in the Huainanzi, there's also a theory of human nature, and that on that basis, a theory of governance. And in the European tradition, there's Rousseau and more. So, as a matter of fact, Ian Shapiro pointed out, every political philosophy takes for granted a view of human nature. So it is on this basis that Ian Shapiro actually made the comment referring to the Western tradition, but actually, as we have seen in the cases of Wong and Saussure, this is perhaps more a human phenomenon, broadly shared by political philosophers around this globe, so long as they are concerned with how humans are by nature when designing their approach to governance. So I would very briefly point out several strengths of this framework. Basically, to address the issues of our time that are truly global in character, intellectual resources produced in various locales need to be put together. And this framework provides one possible way to do so. Under this framework, each scholar still conducts research on their local world that they specialize in. This can be anywhere on this globe and does not have to be post-19th century or another temporal point that globalization was thought to have begun, but anytime. The difference is that one now brings a global perspective to bear on this local study. This is also different from because human nature and governance are both highly general concepts. How humans are, they have, this framework has a wide applicability. At the same time, it means, as I began earlier, I pointed out, it allows scholars to keep focusing on working on their local sources and produce historical scholarship. It is at the same time locally rooted, but the results are globally shareable, given this general tendency that I have illustrated with the previous cases among political philosophers, East and West, past and present. A brief, I'm not sure if I still have time. Do I have? Okay.
Yes, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, good. That's perfect for wrap it up. So one of the drives behind proposing this framework is the thinking that we need to go beyond the Eastern versus West dualism. And the reason is when we see things like human nature in comparative comparative perspective, East versus West, we are already essentializing both the East and the West. To begin with, we as scholars of China, we know how great diversity China has within itself, both past and present, and across the different regions. And even within one region, different in one city, or different thinkers think differently, of course. Even within the West, the previous those approach Chinese political thought philosophically tend to identify the West with liberal democracy, individualism, etc. But actually, we tend to forget this. The West is also, or at least Europe, is also the birthplace of socialism, communism, and fascism. And many of those currents never disappeared. Some are making a strong comeback and may even become mainstream. Who knows? So we need to perhaps avoid using such words to essentialize and hide the internal diversity both within the so-called East and so-called West. But I also wanted to highlight human commonality because as different as we are on the surface, being human is deeply common, and in terms of human nature, perhaps there's more commonality to celebrate than the differences. The second larger point is that this global framework offers a possibility to pull together all relevant resources under one framework so that we can learn from each other and get inspired. And there are no perennial answers or written, there's no ready answers to 21st century issues by no means. But by learning from each other and getting inspired by each other's work, we can probably think better. And by thinking better, we can probably better address the issues that humanity faces together. And that's all. Thank you. I welcome your questions, suggestions, and criticism.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. And we will have a general discussion afterwards. So now we have our next two speakers, Baldwin Wong and Elton Chan, who present a paper with the title Recusing Political Realism by Confucianism on a Confucian account of the realist distinction between ethics and politics. Right? So please, the floor is yours for 20 minutes.
Yes, I mean, we may have to share our PowerPoint first. Yeah. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So, my name is Baldwin Wong, and I am working on political theory and Confucianism. And my research interest is in how Confucian rituals may contribute in addressing the problem of polarization in the democratic society. But anyway, today we will talk about political realism and how Confucianism may rescuing political realism by some of its ideas. So first of all, what is political realism? So political realism is a methodological view of political theory that received increasing attention in recent years. So some political philosophers such as Bernard Williams argues that nowadays political philosophy talk too much about ethics. So political philosophy should talk more about politics and less ethics. So I mean, there are quite a number of political philosophers in this position, and today we will focus on Bernard Williams. So according to Williams, many political philosophers just assume some pre-political ethical ideas and think that these pre-political ethical ideas such as utility, such as autonomy, the Kantian autonomy, or some conceptions of moral right as having some authority over the political ideas or define the proper limit of politics. So this kind of view is called by Williams as political moralism, and this can be represented by Emil Kant's famous sentence, all politics must ban its news before the right. But Williams say, no, it's a wrong view. That's why that's why Bernard Williams rather suggests the autonomous thesis that political values should have its independent rim of normativities. I mean, there are different kinds of normativities. Some are moral normativities and some are political normativities. I mean, it seems the PowerPoint.
Very technical difficulty. I'm getting back to it.
Okay. I mean, so there are different kinds of normativities. Yeah. So some are moral normativities and some are political normativities. Yeah. So political normativities comes from some kind of political values, such as order, or legitimation. So when we evaluate political behavior, we should not use moral values. Rather, we should use some political values. So what defines a policy as politically correct or not depends on whether it can fit with some political principles that come from some political values. So here, Williams suggests a distinctive principle to evaluate a government, which is the BLD, basic legitimation demands. So here we should not, we should not misunderstand Williams as saying that politics is about power, politics is about money, so there's no morality inside. No, Williams is not saying something like this. To Bernard Williams, a legitimate state is not the same with the state with power. So might does not generate right. So in the political area, we can still use normative principle. But Williams rejects the substantial political moral principles such as utilitarianism or Rawlsian theory of justice. He rather proposed a looser standard, that a legitimate state only need to have something to say to each subject. If it has something to say to each subject, then it is legitimate. So legitimacy is to give an explanation of ruling to your subject. So based on this principle, Williams suggests that liberalism is not a universal answer to all societies. So here he suggests a very famous formula: liberalism equals to BLD plus modernity. So liberal democracy works because it is something that could be said to other people in the modern democratic, in the modern pluralistic society. But how about those non-modern, non-pluralistic societies? Well, they may have other kind of states. They may have other kind of non-liberal state that could be legitimate to them. But this comes to a big problem, is that William suggests a principle, but why is this a principle of legitimacy? Why we call this kind of principle? Why we call this kind of state as legitimate? So here, William seems to just take it for granted. He just say that, well, BLD is a claim that inherent in politics in itself. Yeah. So there's nothing. There's nothing he needs to say more. But this comes to a big trouble because this comes to something quite counterintuitive. Because if you are saying that a legitimate state needs to have something to say to the subject, then many totalitarian states can also have something to say to their subject. Many totalitarian states can also say some stories to justify their ruling. So Bernard Williams' proposal seems to be too thin to the extent that it permits a lot of totalitarian states. So that's why in some passage, Bernard Williams seems to be aware of this problem and suggests another principle, which is the critical theory principle. The acceptance of a justification cannot be based on coercive power, so it must be voluntary. So if your story of legitimacy is based on some threat, based on some coercion, then the state is still not legitimate. But this comes to another problem because it blurs the distinction between political moralism and political realism. So it seems to assume another moral values of voluntary endorsement. So here it comes to a more fundamental problem of political realism, that how you draw the line between moral values and political values. Yeah, why are those political values political? Why are those states legitimate? Yeah. So here, Bernard Williams faces a dilemma. A dilemma is that if he defines the political values too thin, too simple, then it compromises with real politics and render many totalitarian regimes legitimate. But if the definition is too thick, then many moral values are introduced into the group of political values. And what is the difference between political realism and political moralism? So here, we believe that Confucianism has something to say because, first of all, Confucianism is quite politically realistic. Its view is quite close to political realism. So, first of all, it seems to, Confucianism seems to give an impression that is kind of political moralism. It's talk about ethics when when they evaluate political affairs. But first of all, to Confucianism, political power is not a kind of brute force. And also, political power is not about natural right to demand. Even if you were born in royal family, it does not mean that you are entitled to a right to rule. So how can a political power to be legitimate? So it involves a minimally acceptable treatment of the people and a willingly acceptance of the political authority. So in the result, it seems to be something quite similar to Bernard Williams' will. But of course, there are some differences that Confucian usually present their will in the language heaven's mandate, say such as the following example. So say, for example, in the book of history, the Wong of Qiao dynasty, when he justified his resistance, he appealed to the heaven's mandate. But if we go through this language of heaven's mandate, we can see that actually it is presenting a quite secular political realism point. So when the Confucian classics talk about heaven's mandate, is about legitimate political authority is derived from the heaven first, and the tyrannical oppression is the main cause for losing legitimate authority. And the political actors act on the heaven's will. And heaven favors the protection of the people. And heaven chooses leaders to govern virtuously. So to this will of heaven's mandate, there are different interpretations. Some interpret as a kind of divine command theory. that there is a high defined object of heaven to justify political authority. Some interpret in the view of political moralism that political authority is an instrument to promote ethical values. But here, we would like to promote the third interpretation of political realism to interpret this idea of heaven's mandate. So here, I would like to pass my time to my friend Elton to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Baldwin. I'm so sorry for the technical stuff. The internet of my university is breaking off from time to time. But let me move on to talk about what we are trying to say here. Is that if the heaven's mandate is either a kind of divine command theory or a kind of political moralism, then it could be of no use of realism, because realism reject both of them. But in our research, we suggest that we can actually reject both of these interpretations. Instead, we author alternative interpretations and we call it the naturalist interpretations. So he basically is based on three claims here. First of all, we believe that his naturalist interpretations, heaven's will, is basically a shorthand for describing the dynamic process of collective human action in the political community. Secondly, the collective human actions, as we're talking about here, is determined by a stable pattern of behavior that are natural to human being. And thirdly, virtues are descriptions of these natural attributes of human beings, as well as the know-how of how to make use of these natural attributes. Now, with these three claims, we can basically reject both the divine command theory interpretation and the political moralism interpretations. But let me go into greater detail. Now, first of all, when we look at the heaven's mandate, is actually hard to not look at these couple of quotes that basically show that heaven's will seems to be accessible only through human will and human actions, right? Heaven sees as people sees, heaven hears as people hear, etc., etc. Now, if we look at these texts and we think about them, then we see that the notion of heaven, even though it's out there, is actually conceptually fused and conflated with the notion of people. Heaven's acceptance of political leader is on the whole manifested through the people's acceptance. Yes, they talk about heaven's mandate, but the heaven's mandate is shown by the people's support. The famous Mencius passage in 585, I'm not going to quote the whole thing, talk about how like Qiao gave the throne to Shun, but it was not Qiao who gave it to him, but it was heaven who gave the throne to King Shun. It was the people who gave the throne to King Shun. And so in here, heaven and people are actually equated in importance. But when we talk about the people's acceptance, it should be clear that it is not really a legal concept, right? We're not saying that there is such a way that people already have some kind of legal status to grant acceptance to a political leader. That's not what we're saying, because the people's acceptance here is the origin of political authority, meaning it is prior to all political authority, and you need political authority to define legal authority. So people's acceptance here is before legal authority, is not a legal concept. But it is also not just some kind of quiet moral concept that it's just nice to have. But in Confucianism, we argue that they see that there are real political consequences that will lead to political challenges and will lead to regime collapse if you do not pay attention to the people's acceptance. People's acceptance here, we propose, is in fact a realist concept, in the sense that it is a matter of political reality that whether one has the support of the people or not. If you lose support, there will be overall weakening of the regime. And in that sense, it will be very similar to de facto legitimacy. You have legitimacy because you have gained legitimacy. That is the de facto one. Or in a more realist flavor, we can call it maybe in politics, nothing succeeds like success. Now, let's take a look, think about this Mencius passage to illustrate the point, right? In the passage, Mencius was advocating benevolent governance, and he was asking King Qi whether the king of Qi, whether a small state could win over the big state, and the king said no. And here, in 187, Mencius said to them, well, that means that the small is no match for the big, a few no match for the many, and the weak no match for the strong. Within the seas, there are 9 areas of 10,000 li squares, and territory of Qi make up one of them. For one to try to overcome the other 8 is no different from this small state try to win over a superpower. So why not go back to the fundamentals? Now, if you practice benevolence in government of your state, then all those in the empire will seek office in your place, all the tillers' land will come to you, all the merchants will come to you, and all the travelers will come to you, and all those who hate the rulers will also come to you. Who can stop you from becoming a true king? Now, if we think about it, consider this passage, right? Mencius' defense for treating the people well, giving them minimally good treatment was not merely because it's something nice to do. What he was arguing was in fact a power calculation. Weaker strength is no match for greater strength, and more acceptance of people equate to greater strength. Mencius would say this is why he who gains the confidence of the people will be the emperor. And in this case, we can try to reinterpret the heaven's mandate, right? Heaven's mandate is the source of legitimacy, yes. And to whom the mandate is given is determined by the acceptance of the people. And the people's acceptance is generated by proper treatment of them. And that is akin to the basic legitimation demand that you have to do something for them. The people's acceptance of a leader generates power for the leader. And the leader who treats the people well will receive the heaven's mandate. And a leader who oppresses the people will lose the acceptance and hence lose the heaven's mandate. And the oppressive regimes are subject to challenge to new leaders who receive the people's challenge from the leaders who receive the people's acceptance. In this case, heaven's mandate is not exactly a divine command in the sense that it describes the dynamic process of collective human action in political community. It is dynamic describing of how people will behave when they're treated in a certain way. When power is generated, and power will be generated by this dynamic process of somebody claiming authority and the corresponding acceptance of people because they were treated in a certain way. Now, here we're not supposing any democratic rights or entitlement, just like Williams was saying that there is no democracy before modern times. People don't have a natural right to rule under this description. They're not entitled to any sort of formal mechanism to select a leader. But what is in place is a natural dynamic. The people will accept a leader and the political authority that will be helpful and support the minimally well treatment of the people. But how do we know what treatment will actually attract the people? Well, one thing that we reject here is some kind of radical pluralism. This is something that Confucianism and we also reject. There seems to be certain natural agreements on a range of treatment that is prevalent to everyone, that we can accept that these are things that we want. Physical safety, shelter, food of survival, simple comfort, safety for family members, sufficient supply of resources, basic educations, basic enjoyments, all these things seems to be something that there's wide agreement upon. And these patterns are natural and stable to a point that it seems that people, when they are treated in this way, they're more willing to accept the authority of the leader. And this pattern, Confucianism will argue, extend beyond just material need. So in this famous book of poetry passage that is quoted by Mencius, talk about how the way the social relationship that we have were actually endowed by heaven, that we endow with these natural features. And human beings also tend to thrive under certain socio-cultural conditions in which that the corresponding values that we will have, such as love, appropriateness, trust, and respect and fairness, all seems to be natural attributes that human beings have. And if you correspond to them, naturally human beings will find them to be more favorable. And this is, when we talk about these things as natural, we do not mean it as some kind of moral objectivist argument that they are external to human beings. They're not. They are internal to human beings. There's not some objective or external standard that should be imposed upon human beings. They are valid only to the extent that human beings internally accept them. But they're also not merely subjective preferences either, in the sense that they are very, very prevalent. So it seems to be some kind of stable pattern that we can see. So the natural attributes as endowed by the species humanity is what we argue. And it will be compatible with human rights discourse because, like, if you have these things as natural, it'd be nice to protect them by right, but it need not be human right because it's not really entitlement, it's not really kind of moral status, it's not constitutional entitlement, but it will be compatible and be favorable to have it because we want to protect it this way. Now, I don't really have time to talk about virtues, but we argue that virtue actually have shared very similar situations here. That virtues, as Confucianism will argue, is natural and is essential for good governance as well. I will just fly through here, but what we do argue is that when virtue is also understood as natural, in this naturalistic interpretation of virtues, we see that there is, we can reject the political moralism interpretation because we're not saying that virtue has some kind of primacy over other considerations. We're simply saying that virtues are very useful in generating power because people naturally respond to those virtues. So I guess our basic argument is this: political realism is the conclusion here. Political realism is correct in the sense that politics is an independent realm, that it is functioning under some kind of forces of reality, human motivation, institutional arrangement, power calculation, power dynamics, etc. But what Confucianism are different from the current realists is that we see that virtues and desires for basic proper treatment is part of that reality, in the sense that we argue that the realists should consider Confucianism's naturalist justification for the BLD, and that is BLD are indeed manifestation of values, but these moral values should be manifested not because they're moral, but because they're part of the reality that we live in. And ignoring them will only have dire consequences. And here we will end with this quote saying that, like, those who make the people a hateful enemy will always be defeated by the people. And so we argue that the BLD should be part of the realism, and the BLD should have the basic moral values as well. But we argue that realism should not shy away from it, rather should take it as part of the human nature, and therefore is a political reality that we all have to deal with. Sorry for overrun a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also for sticking to the time. Don't worry, you use your 20 minutes. And now we have our next speaker, Dawid Rogacz, who is a professor at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan, and he will talk about sincerity as a civic virtue. Please, Dawid.
Yes, thank you. So I will just let me go to the point. I'd like to analyze some sort of a case study in an encounter between Chinese and Western political discourses, which is, I think, especially important given the fact that nowadays Jiyan mentioned Daniel Bell, Bai Tongdong, etc. This encounter quite often has an antagonistic character. And I'd like to ask ourselves about a possibility of at least less antagonistic meeting between these two traditions of political thought, focusing on sincerity as a civic virtue. So, of course, the concept of the civic virtue as a different entity distinguished within ethical and political theory as Western, and it's associated mostly with Michael Sandel, and is connected with this now long-lasting critique of Rawls' version of liberalism, and it mainly argues that if procedures of public legitimacy are to be efficient, citizens need to be concerned about the public good, and this wouldn't be done without them having civic virtues, namely virtues of people qua citizens, some sort of moral character of the citizens. Without that, Sandel argues in Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, and also in Democracy's Discontent, which is quoted here, without that, they will be seriously unable to foster the public concerns on which liberty depends. And of course, we have many limitations with regard to applying or referring this concept to classical Confucian theory. Fortunately for me, Sung-Moon Kim wrote two important books on that topic, Public Reason, Confucianism, and recently Theorizing Confucian Virtue Politics, which makes some profound arguments for feasibility of such a strategy. But here I will, of course, try to refer it to the situation of political situation of the Chinese, in the sense that by citizens will, of course, understand subjects of the sovereign. But I think that this is like the only serious limitation, at least in the starting point of my interpretation. And especially, I'm glad that Elton's part of the talk was before mine, his realist interpretation, because I'd like to have a maybe different look at this famous passage from the Analects, which in my view, in my opinion, Confucius argues there that virtues are instrumental in sustaining the efficacy and stability of governance, because the passage goes as follows: those who rule by virtue may be compared to the pole star, which remains in its place while all the other stars turn towards it. If people are ruled by regulations that kept in line with punishments, they will just try to avoid them without feeling shame. But if they're led by virtue and disciplined by customs, they shall have a sense of remorse and, moreover, a proper attitude. So taking within brackets all the implicit polemics with quasi-legalist philosophers there, what we have there is that rule by virtue is instrumental in sustaining the efficacy and stability of governance. It's not that we can pretend to be virtuous, but looking at that from the political viewpoint, it turns out that it is much more successful in obtaining the very same values that political realists want to obtain, that they are allegedly universally efficient means, such as hard punishments. And to rule by virtue means here also, if we take the entirety of the analects into consideration, to lead by example. It's not just to rule by virtue in any way whatsoever. So it means that the ruler is just like this pole star at the beginning of the passage, is to transform the people by his own example. So therefore people like lean towards him. So this is a reciprocal relation in which the governing shine in virtue, which, if we want, may be called more political one, or someone Kim distinguishes political virtue as some sort of subsort, actually, of civic virtue, and the governed lean towards them, equipped with these civic virtues in the strict sense. But here's the thing which Kim emphasizes, that neither Confucius in his view nor ancient Confucians in general recognize the analytical distinction between civic and moral virtues, seeing the continuum between the domains of ethics and politics, and this is what he calls a virtuonism. And this is fine, I think, but it doesn't mean that they did not think of civic virtues as such, because while it is true that Confucius certainly did not believe in there being distinctively civic virtues, in the sense that virtues that are not reflected in the domain of personal and familial moral cultivation. So they did not believe, I think, in distinctively civic virtues that cannot be reflected in these areas, but they were at the same time strongly inclined towards thinking of virtues in terms of clusters, the broad meaning of which varies depending upon the relation one finds oneself in, so that at some point, usually after like exceeding familiar relations, when one has to act as a citizen or as a subject, they become civic virtues. And we know from the general orientation of Confucian ethics and from the discussions between virtue ethicists and role ethicists, that maybe the truth indeed lies in between, in the sense that virtues are encompassing different structuring, sometimes hierarchically structured relations. For instance, if we take Jiyan, benevolence, charity into account, so charity towards animals surely consists in actions different than being charitable towards one's parents, while the latter includes much more moral obligation than we have and feel. This is this naturalistic, by the way, element towards the strangers. And also within one and the same relationship, father's care for his son is different from the latter's filial solicitude. So we are in no position to essentialize virtues on the grounds of Confucianism. It's not an ethical dictionary of cardinal virtues. We have to be very contextual. And if we, for instance, take a closer look into the analect, we'll see that Confucius states that governmental matters are actually different from private affairs, and that the qualities expected, this is like a paraphrase of the quote, qualities expected from an official are distinct from and more demanding than filiality and fraternity alone. Tao Jiang, in his recent excellent book, shows that there are many passages in which we see that despite the whole rhetoric of the analects, the transition from the private to the public or from the familial to the political is not as continuous as probably Confucius would have wanted to be. And we have a very interesting passage that gives us a hint about these civic virtues in Confucius, which is, of course, not as explicit as maybe we want it to be. It is not righteous not to take office. If you cannot neglect the relation between elders and youngsters, how can you then discard the righteousness in between the sovereign and minister? You wish to keep your hands from getting dirty, yet allow chaos to be brought to that great relationship. An exemplary man takes office and performs the righteousness belonging to it. 心气义. So we have this intriguing idea of a righteousness specific to this office, and that it is something in a way qualitatively different. But at the same time, we see there a clear hope that civic virtue will follow the moral one, that if one is able to perform her or his familial duties, then sure, he should be perfectly as much able to be a good citizen. But for Confucius and for other early thinkers from this Zhuzhia camp, such as the authors of the Zwo commentary, sincerity was not yet the most important, the pivotal civic virtue. It was rather trustworthiness. So in the Annals, we read, for instance, that governance can survive without arms and even food supplies, but not without the trust of the people. And this in turn is gained when those in power are trustworthy. So we again have this interplay of civic and political sincerity. And this relation is reciprocal, which means that the officials and the people transformed by the example of the leader trying in a way to earn his trust by means of their own reliability, trustworthiness. And this trustworthiness, Xin, gives them also additional powers to address issues of public concern. In this passage in 1910, Confucius says that if someone lacks Xin, yet criticizes or his sovereign, he can be deemed hypocritical or simply too critical, and we can develop the idea encapsulated there, not actually interested in the subject of the criticism, the public good, but rather simply vilifying, this is the word used there, vilifying the sovereign. So we see that this gives somehow the citizens powers to analogous maybe even to modern civic engagement. And we have more stories like that in the Zwo commentary. Let us, I know Yuri is there, but for the sake of brevity, Zwo Qiaoming narrates, right, the story recorded in the Zwo commentary, that the marquis who gave up a siege due to the, that there was a marquis of Jiyan, as I recall, who gave up a siege of the city due to the loss of trustworthiness in the eyes of the besieged people. And it is important that we are talking about the trustworthiness in the eyes of the people. He could have been trustworthy per se, but it doesn't matter if he had like a bad image. So we have this idea of relatively independent Xin. And Xin is also recorded to be expected in interstate relations and also in the crucial practice of political practice of covenants, Meng, which were voluntarily joined on an equal footing by the parties which publicly accepted its terms. And I think that these terms of covenants, Meng, are the closest counterpart of the conditions of public legitimacy in roles and generally Western liberal discourse that we have in classical political Chinese thought or Confucian thought in particular. And Zwo commentary explicitly states that the equal parties had to prove that trustworthiness. But with time, it was acknowledged, and we already have passages in the Guoyu discourses of the states, that trustworthiness is nothing but an external manifestation of an inner excellence, inner virtue of sincerity or constancy, oneness between one's words and deeds. And a thinker who was, of course, very much interested in elaborating upon the structure of human nature, all the dispositions that we have, and then sprout and extend towards larger socio-political field was Mencius, and it was him who gave like a model description of the Confucian approach to sincerity. And quite importantly, the context of this definition, as we may say, is the discussion that someone who wants to obtain the trust of his sovereign has to prove that he's trusted by amongst his friends, and this can be done only when one is equipped with sincerity. So we see that sincerity is actually introduced as a condition for there being stable relations between the governed and the governing. And the Mencius definition goes as follows: there's a way of being sincere. If someone's not clear about what is good, he cannot be sincere. That's why sincerity is the way of heaven. One reflection upon how to be sincere is the way of man, and never has there been one who had sincerity but was unable to move others. So first of all, sincerity presumes knowledge of the good it serves. One cannot do bad sincerely. It's not straightforwardness. someone can be a straightforward liar. So sincerity lies in being faithful to one's moral nature. In another passage, we read that a nobleman, an exemplary man, Jiyan, can be deceived, but as long as his conduct is genuinely not against the way, Fei Dao, he's sincere, or his conduct should be deemed sincere. And in a similar vein, we read that a sincere and heartfelt subjection is always based on the superior's virtue and never on coercion, which echoes this passage from the Analects on the rule by virtue. Secondly, what we find in this definition is that sincerity is natural, in the sense that it is an inborn quality of human beings, but a part of distinctive moral nature, not the nature that we share with the animals. It is the nature that has its source in heaven, at least according to Mencius. And this sincerity has nothing in common with pretending, which means that it maybe is natural to morally developed individuals, but it's not easy to achieve, and it requires constant moral development, and its application, importantly, in particular situations, requires constant reflection, similarly to Aristotle's phronesis, I would say. Mencius uses their word si, but also he defines si as turning towards oneself, fan shen. So we see clearly that it is about reflection and deliberation, probing oneself whether one is or not sincere. And finally, sincerity is intrinsically social, able to move others, as we had in the definition, as being sincere solely to oneself is not sincerity at all. So not only is civic sincerity in this account an extension of naturally endowed moral sincerity, but also the latter cannot be really fully realized without the civic virtue of Chen, given the unavoidable character of the relations of power. And this account was developed by the Great Learning, which offers a classical exposition of this continuous link between moral and civic sincerity. It starts with knowledge that has to be developed to the utmost and intentions that are deemed sincere. And then, according to Dacier, the mind is rectified, the person is cultivated, the families are regulated, and the states are put in order. On top of that, when there is order in the states, there is peace in the world. So we have this twofold conclusion. What is called being sincere in one's intentions allows no self-deception, as when we hate a bad smell and love what is good looking. This is also called being unassuming. So the Great Learning does not say that we have to pretend integrity so to have peace in our state. No, it's like a side effect of our moral cultivation, but precisely for this reason, it becomes some sort of civic virtue. And it is therefore said that when there is sincerity within, it is manifested without. And I think that this is the nicest summary of this idea that sincerity should serve as an inner ground for externally recognized trustworthiness, which then guarantees the efficacy and stability of the state. And what we have here, the order, zhi, peace, pian, are all political rather than moral goods. This is something that should also be emphasized. And Jiyan shared this idea that sincerity serves political goods, but he obviously departed from both Dacier and Mencius and his account of its role. So Jiyan explicitly states that there is a difference between sincerity in the familial relations and sincerity as related to sovereigns and superiors. Juan Shang. So we're not just speaking about rulers, but generally superiors like our bosses. And in both cases, sincerity is not about some sort of inner quality rooted in mysteriously understood heaven, but it simply follows, under Jiyan's reading, the constancies of nature. So we are constant in our thought, language, and conduct. But the function of this constancy is, unlike the constancies to be found in nature, political. And that's why Jiyan calls sincerity the basis of government affairs that guarantees the stable rule. What is more, sincerity is required for the common people who are bad by nature in Jiyan's philosophy, to make them nonetheless comply with the political order. And for that reason, Jiyan offers a moderate defense of hegemon as a political ideal, which was something unthinkable to Mencius, I think. So a hegemon, who is not yet righteous, can run still a stable state consisting of sincere and reliable members. These members are called shi, just like scholars / officials, soldiers, etc. So we are told that if we have sincerity, we don't have to bother ourselves with humanness, benevolence, with righteousness, but we are already achieving perhaps the only thing that we're looking for, namely the stability of our states. So this is a powerful message to all the rulers that Xunzi gives. You need to have sincere citizens, and for that purpose, you have to be sincere on your part too, because you are making this transformative effort on the intrinsically bad nature. So sincerity leads to transforming others, but Xunzi also adds an important passage that I think differs him from more realist thinkers active at the time, that only when sincerity is accompanied by Zhen and Yi, then only then does it assist the process and helps develop the process of mind cultivation. So gaining this political stability is one thing. You don't have to, you can do without Zhen and Yi in this case, but you need to have trustworthy, sincere citizens and be sincere by yourself. But if you want to be developed morally by the same sincerity, then it needs to be accompanied by other virtues. But still, it was, I would say, a departure from the mentioned account. And let me just make a large skip. It's not that the Han thinkers were disinterested.
About 2 minutes, Dawid. 2 minutes left.
Okay. So my skip to sincerity and loyalty in the essentials of governance, Professor De Verde was talking about. We have here a very interesting account about of relation between sincerity and loyalty. It is argued that the state depends on virtue and propriety, and sovereign should especially protect sincerity and good faith. And when those are established, those below will not be double-minded. And if orders are not followed through, then it clearly means that they lack sincerity. So the official that demonstrates loyalty needs to be also equipped with sincerity and trustworthiness. And it is again shown as a reciprocal relation between the subordinates and the sovereign. And Wei Jiyan, who is the author of these words, continues that today in his situation, people are accusing others to be sincere and take those who form factions as sharing virtues. And then he clearly criticized factions as such, arguing that if you're really interested in the common good, and if you're sincerely interested in the common good, and you're advising your sovereign that he should do this or that, and this sovereign was Han Taizong, then you should not be interested in forming political parties. And eunuchs are clearly interested in the latter. So they're trying to take the best out of their political careers under the guise of advising the emperor what is allegedly good for the state. So this was a very interesting reflection upon the relation between another political virtue of zhong, loyalty, and its relation to sincerity, that they both should go in tandem, and that in this sense sincerity is distinctively civic, because it is oriented and targeted at the common good, unlike loyalty, which is when lost or deprived of its connection with sincerity, could lead to forming parties, factions, and those who form them cannot be really trusted, and this certainly does not guarantee the stability of the state. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so roles on sincerity and Habermas. If you give me 30 seconds, okay, I skipped roles and Habermas. This is already an anathema amongst political theorists. So just two conclusions is that sincerity is in both views, the Western one that I had to miss and the Chinese one, a necessary condition for the stability of just institutions. And members of the state must be sincere about their intentions. Sincerity is then verified through their actions and allows no self-deception. Both approaches agree that sincerity must be assumed rather than proved, that it is natural moral sentiment or virtue or consistency or claim for it. But two main differences go as follows. In Confucianism, there's a continuous link between moral, civic, and political virtues, and virtues are clusters differentiated upon relations rather than discrete fields. And the second main difference, and this is my last word, the conditions of feudal monarchy imply for Confucians that the rule itself does not have to be legitimized, but it will not last long without change of both the ruler and the ruled, the latter being inspired by the former. Thank you very much, and sorry for the delay.
Thank you, Dawid. Thank you very much. And now we have our last speaker for this session, Yang Fu from the National Taiwan University, who will talk about whose paper is entitled "Bring the Tao to the World: 语音史 and the Study of Chinese Political Thought." So please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Am I loud enough? Okay, brilliant. Thank you. It's an honor having this chance to present my work at this workshop today. I'm Yang Fu from National Taiwan University. I'm basically a political and intellectual historian of early and medieval China. The paper itself is a byproduct of my ongoing project of the political culture of the Han Dynasty, as well as my long-time interest in the practice of the history of political thought in general. I very much look forward to any suggestion and criticism. Did my slide change? Okay, cool. As many humanities scholars of China should know, Yu Yingshi, who passed away just a few months ago, has made great contributions to the knowledge of Chinese history and culture. Nevertheless, whether in Chinese, English, or Japanese academia, few have consciously talked about Yu's insights into Chinese political thought. This is all the more perplexing, as he has been renowned for, among other things, works on the history of Chinese thought, on intellectuals in Chinese history, and on the history of the Confucian tradition. In my opinion, the phenomenon is primarily due to the fact that Yu's research cannot easily fit the prevalent paradigms of the study of Chinese political thought. For theory-driven scholars, although Yu has long been concerned with modern political values such as liberty, rights, and democracy, he is after all recognized as a historian, indifferent to articulating Chinese political ideas from comparative, contemporary, and theoretical perspectives. For those dedicated to the history of Chinese political thought, the dominant approach can be categorized as canon-based or great thinker-centered. As a result, Yu's writings may not ring a bell at first glance. But as far as I'm concerned, the study of political thought should embrace both historical and theoretical perspectives, or as Dr. Qiao just mentioned, historical and philosophical perspectives. From a historical perspective, then, I agree with Benjamin Schurz that political thought should consist of not only one's original arguments about politics, but also be concerned with how people in the past had responded to their real-life political and social problems in intellectual ways. In this light, my article sets out to review Yu's contributions to the study of Chinese political thought. I attempt to demonstrate that to Yu, bringing the Tao to the world, or 行道 于世, was the utmost concern to the Confucian tradition, and accordingly, the history of Chinese political thought may well be taken as stories of how in the imperial power structure, such an ideal had been perceived, interpreted, and put into practice by various people and groups. Yu's writings, both microscopic arguments and the individual case studies, have provided keys to reading and retelling such stories. In my paper, I talk about Yu's observations on the emperorship, his view of the interplay between the intellectual and the political authority, and how the different layers of order were conceived of in pre- and imperial China. And in the conclusion, I also briefly examine Yu's attitudes towards modern Chinese political culture. So let me summarize some of the points I raised in the article. To Yu, the emperor and his power had been extremely influential in shaping Chinese political culture and political thought. In general, he agrees that during the imperial period, there was no systematic measure to restrict the emperor's power. Despotism or 专制 is therefore considered a qualified term for the power of emperorship. Indeed, the despotic nature of Chinese emperorship has been a topic of discussions. Yu's insights lie not in indicating that the emperor in China had unlimited power, but in showing the ways in which the emperor and his power had affected political ideas at different historical situations. Within Yu's many writings, the 1976 article Anti-Intellectualism and the Chinese Political Tradition is probably the most straightforward in self-identifying as a work on Chinese political thought. It argues that in pre-imperial China, the Confucian political thought could be described as intellectualism, while the Taoist and the legalist political thought anti-intellectualism. More importantly, these three schools of thought converged in the Han Dynasty in the sense that Confucian learning was legalized. Its implication, Yu maintains, was that the emperor was so highly esteemed that he was the pivot of social, political, even cosmic order. In theory, the emperor would not misbehave, and therefore, no criticism over him was allowed, entailing millennia-long anti-intellectualism in Chinese political culture. Also, in addition to political dimensions, morality, especially politicized morality, served as another main source of anti-intellectualism in China. In short, the thesis that a person of virtue should rule all under heaven was turned upside down into the person who rules the all under heaven must possess virtue, and therefore the emperor was normally viewed as living up to the ideal of sagehood. To say that the emperorship entailed anti-intellectualism does not mean it had nothing to do with political thought. On the contrary, anti-intellectualism manifested itself as a form of political discourse. On the one hand, the emperor could sanction his own interpretations of text. In the case of the Lao Tzu, for example, some emperors read it as a book about how to secure the ruler's power and obscurantism. On the other hand, the emperor also intended to control speeches and thoughts. We note in an article that the late imperial period was the heyday of thought control. Such omitted passages we suggest can more or less relate to modern democratic thoughts, and under the high pressure of thought control, the emperor's writings and speeches became people's required readings and led to a certain degree of dogmatism. In his more recent work, Yu has further argued that under the pressure imposed by the emperor, the Confucian tradition was forced to reorient in the Ming Dynasty. Yu argues that because there existed only a thin chance for Confucian scholars to pursue a political career and fulfill their ideal, Confucianism in the early Ming more single-mindedly concentrated on the cultivation of virtue and the investigation of abstract and metaphysical ideas. The turning point was Wang Yangming, who consciously sought to escape from power and propose a new theory. This change to political thought is significant. The originality was that Wang Yangming determined to make use of the innate knowledge of the good, or liangzhi, to bring the order to all under heaven by means of looking downward to the common people and awakening them, the so-called Jueming. However, according to Yu, although the emperor and his power stood as an inevitable referential point in Chinese political thought, we must not reduce all representations of Chinese political thought simply as corollaries of the subjection to the emperor. Overall, he has made at least 4 important points in relation to the role of the intellectual in the history of Chinese political thought. First, he has taken a comparative perspective and proposed that the Chinese version of philosophical breakthrough took the form of reinterpreting the existing social, political, and cultural tradition by means of the Way, or as we know, Dao. Second, the Chinese intellectual from the 5th century BCE had begun to concentrate on changing the world with the Way. The most representative manifestation of this tendency in political thought, of course, was the idea of ordering the world, or 经世. Third, the concern with ordering the world had encouraged the intellectual to seek opportunities to serve the state, and finally, as there was no systematic institutional measure to restrict the power of the emperorship, when facing the emperor, the intellectual had to have a solid ground in order to gain legitimacy. To Yu, this contributed to another major characteristic of the Chinese intellectual, that is, emphasis on moral self-cultivation. After all, morality or virtue was the ultimate source for the intellectual to criticize political authorities. The general viewpoints above are based on solid case studies. I would like to highlight just 3 points. First, Yu's research reminds us where and whom to see for the study of political thought at different historical moments. For example, to study political thought in medieval China from the perspective of intellectuals, we should pay more attention not to Confucian scholars, but to the Taoist intellectuals, to preeminent Buddhist monks, and to certain men of literary talents. Second, as morality was conceived of a prerequisite for political criticisms, ethical arguments in China should always be incorporated into the study of political thought. And the previous presentation by Professor Rogacz is a case in point, I think. And third, criticisms over the autocracy of the emperor had been an underlying feature of Chinese political thought. Clearly, to Yunshi, the intellectual's quest for order under the emperor's rule is a central topic in the history of Chinese political thought. What then was the content of such order? In Yu's writings, discussions about order are nearly always linked to Confucianism. In the paper, Yu talks about the Chinese idea of order by emphasizing the role of interpersonal relationships, or lun. Most importantly, all the 5 fundamental relationships, including that between the ruler and the minister, were seen by the ancients as a natural thing, and every ideal and the institution could be understood as manifestations of such natural order. We also point out the significance of the family in the above theory of natural relations, whose underlying values included, among others, evenness, stability, and harmony. And it was through ritual that this natural-based order could be extended from the individual to the family and to all other social institutions, including the state. In historical context, we see how intellectuals and officials try to impose order, or different layers of order, at different times. In the paper on Confucian thought and practices in the Han, we also distinguishes cultural order from political order, and suggests that to Confucius and his followers, the priority should be given to the former, that is, cultural order. This cultural order had 2 major aims: to restrict the emperor's power in accordance with Confucian political theories, and to unify various regional cultures under the aegis of Confucian values. Yu explicitly argues that enriching the people first and then educating them, or 先富后教, stood as the core idea of the Confucian political thought. This, I think, can well echo a sort of realism argued by Professor Wong and Professor Chan in this very session. Yu's research on the Song Confucianism further stressed the role of order in Chinese political thought. It argues that from the beginning, the central concern of Song Confucianism had always been the reconstruction of order. This remained the case for Neo-Confucianism in the Southern Song. For Zhuxi and his alike, they tried to provide for the order reconstruction with a more solid ground, that is, morality attained through strict, or should I say, more strict spiritual trainings. In other words, they still had political aspirations and indeed attempted to make use of power to fulfill the goal of order reconstruction. Moreover, in response to critiques of his studies on the Song Confucianism, we emphasize that the Confucian project ever since early China had been first and foremost concerned with order reconstruction, and that what he means by the order of the human world, or 人间秩序, is not confined to political order. Rather, the so-called order reconstruction started from the most basic unit of society, namely family. Everyone from the beginning of life is located in multiple layers of order. Therefore, he highlights, every order could become an object of reconstruction. To me, identifying different layers of order in various Confucian discourses could be a rewarding task in the study of Chinese political thought. It should be noted that Yu has also talked about Chinese political thought beyond the confinement of Confucianism, the best example of which is his research on the intellectual transitions in early medieval China. Simply put, he argues that Taoist teachings and the emphasis on feeling or qing, or emotion, could be employed to articulate political thought and to challenge Confucian ideas. According to Yu's research, this was the case in early medieval China, and could also be seen in Cao Xueqing's anti-traditionalist thought. Yu has also shown that traditional Chinese political ideas have shaped the history of political thought of modern China. In his study on Sun Yat-sen, Yu points out that Sun's doctrine of the three principles of the people had its roots in traditional Chinese culture. He also suggests that Mao Zedong, despite of his image as a revolutionary leader and his anti-traditional thought, was by nature a product of the traditional Chinese political culture, especially his inclination toward despotism. Be it positive or negative, we can see from these two extremely important figures that the traditional or imperial past did exert great influences on their political thought. On another note to Yu, the Confucian tradition itself is beneficial to China's absorption of modern Western political concepts. He indicates that Confucian scholars in the late 19th century were open to many Western ideas, and it remained alive in interpreting and employing these Western resources. Overall, Yu has believed that the Confucian tradition is compatible with modern democratic thought. He argues that in the late 19th century up to 1990, I quote, "The idea of democracy found its most sympathetic audience in China among the intellectual elite," unquote. And it was because of warfare that the elite culture in the 1940s declined. And I quote, "The idea of democracy soon began to go through several ideological twists until it was distorted beyond recognition," unquote. Apparently, the Confucian tradition has played a crucial role in Yu's understanding of Chinese history and culture. Kim Yongming, the discussant of this very session, has called our attention to the danger of essentialism when taking Confucianism, I quote, as a programmatic concept of Chinese culture, unquote. How then should we evaluate Yu's insights into Chinese political thought? On the one hand, I think Yu certainly cannot escape such criticisms, especially when talking about modern China, because in his writings, Confucianism serves as an equivalent to Chinese culture that was opposite to the Western civilization. On the other hand, however, Yu has quite consciously analyzed the Confucian tradition through historical lens. Compared to theory-driven researchers, Yu's idea of the Confucian project leads us to not just abstract concepts and values, but also concrete institutions and the practices at all levels throughout China's past. In this vein, I dare to suggest that Yu and King may well be similar in their methodological stance on the study of the history of Chinese political thought. In conclusion, we may say that Yu's alternative approach to the study of Chinese political thought lies in putting people and texts in their specific historical situations and various contexts. While ideas conventionally viewed as great and original remain targets of research, equal efforts should be made to understand how people in the past thought about and responded to what they encountered and consider as political problems. This understanding is also held by some intellectual historians and historians of political thought of Europe. Just as John Bureau has suggested, the history of political thought should be attentive to, I quote, forms of human activity rather than to some historical encounter of abstract categories, unquote. By linking text to practices, the emperor to Confucian intellectuals, and the history of thought to social political history, Yu has enormously contributed to the study of the history of Chinese political thought as a human activity. Of course, within Yu's works, there are some major topics that didn't get enough treatment, especially gender, religion, and the ethnic issues. To me, it would be very fruitful if we can make use of contextual thought, analyze the role of these elements in Chinese political thought. With more combined efforts, the study of Chinese political thought, whether historical or theoretical, should have more and its deserved place in the study of political thought of the humankind. So I hope that is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Yang Fu and to all our speakers. And now it's